6 days you may labor and do all your work.
But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God.
Keep it separate. Keep it set apart from the ordinary rhythm of time.
There's a good reason why, historians are saying that post-World War II, we enter the period called the Great Acceleration. It's that people now feel the pacing of their lives has accelerated to a point where they don't have time to care for themselves. They don't have time to care for family members.
I think our culture right now is profoundly burned out.
2/3 of Americans say that they're working more than 40 hours any given week. We have to work more in order to sustain the same level of living.
The labor movement in America is a surprisingly religious story, and it does often converge at the issue of Sabbath.
Shabbat is a revolutionary concept. It actually changed human history. For the first time, it introduced the concept of mandated rest.
The very heart of the idea is a kind of workers' rights idea.
Sabbath has ethical implications. Work should not be what defines us as human beings.
It's a commandment. It comes from God. That's why we observe Shabbat.
As a Christian, I don't think we take the Sabbath seriously enough.
If Sabbath rest was going to flourish and live in their lives, something else was going to have to die.
And I just never had an appreciation for the Sabbath day or understanding of it. All of that came to me recently. And I've been pastoring 34 years.
A lot of what it translates into is, I wish I just had more time in which I just paused to breathe, to think about what it was that I was actually chasing after.
We realize that time is our only non-renewable resource.
Latino Catholics identify with the story of Exodus, the story of the Israelites wandering the desert.
It's like the whole week is hectic, and then all of a sudden, you light the Shabbos candles, and you're in a different world.
Sabbath isn't simply a pious teaching. It's not an add-on. What's at issue is the very meaning of life.
Major funding for this program was provided by Lilly Endowment. Additional funding provided by the Fetzer Institute, helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Danny and Alyssa Keto. The E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. And Skip and Fran Minikowski.
Americans work hard, Americans work long hours, but the sheer reality of it too is that our wages have stagnated, so a lot of the overworking is actually also attributed to the fact that we have to work more in order to sustain the same level of living.
People are on edge, they're emotional, and I would say spiritual tanks are not full.
And in a global economy, the worries come at you from every place imaginable, right? People, even when they are not working, are thinking about their working. They're worried about what the competition is doing.
There's a lot of talk about unplugging, and there's an unplugging movement that we need to be able to not answer emails. We need to be able to turn off our computers and have time together, which I think is true. The thing that I think the unplugging movement misses is that we have to do this at the same time. Because if we don't, we're never really going to be able to relax. Because we don't trust that our coworker is unplugging too.
I'm a specialist in internal medicine, somatic diseases. And what do we have in somatic realities that seem to indicate stress? Well, one of the biggest expenditures in health plans are drugs for gastroesophageal reflux, that you have heartburn. It's a huge expenditure, and it is a symbol of stress.
Overworking or working so much, working so many hours, has effects on all sorts of social aspects of our lives, including our relationships, certainly our ability to devote time to the people that we love, including our family members, our spouses, our children.
We also have a very big item of drugs for mood disorders, mild depression or moderate depression. And I think these are markers of a stressed out society where we might have to look for some other reset, some other remedy. And maybe the Sabbath could be that remedy.
Sabbath is an ancient practice rooted in the biblical story of creation. God, having made the world and seeing it was good, rested. And then in the Ten Commandments, humanity was instructed to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Today, Sabbath is practiced by some as a 24-hour period that is both a commandment and a gift. From a more secular perspective, it offers a respite from the pace of modern life. For others, it's an invitation to reconnect with creation and to reimagine ideas of community in a time set apart from ordinary time. All of it can be seen as part of the Sabbath story. But there was a time not long ago when the Christian majority culture mandated Sabbath rest. They were called Sunday closing laws, or blue laws, designed to afford people time for God, family, and rest.
When I grew up, Sunday was sacred. You couldn't buy liquor, you didn't do any work, you didn't do any shopping, you couldn't because all the stores were closed, you know.
The history of the word blue in blue laws either comes from the paper that the laws were written on, or it comes from a bit of 18th century slang that means overly strict.
They're descendants of the old Puritan laws about Sabbath observance. You start to see references to the blue laws referring to these, especially Sabbath regulations, with regard to business on Sundays or prohibiting business on Sundays.
For some, the Sunday laws were always seen as a violation of the First Amendment, the forcing of a religious practice onto the wider society.
Sunday laws have always been rooted in religious tradition. They've always been a form of favoritism of the majoritarian religion, and they've always really violated the spirit of keeping church and state separate.
In the early 1960s, the Sunday sales laws were challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court upheld the laws, claiming they had evolved into a secular custom with benefits for everyone. Judge Felix Frankfurter, one of the first Jews appointed to the Supreme Court, called the Sunday sales laws a secular, civic institution.
The Sabbath is a cultural asset of importance, a release from the daily grind, a preserve of mental peace, an opportunity for self-disposition, which is, I think, the best argument for a secular Sabbath you could possibly have.
Yet over the next decades, the Sunday closing laws would start to look like a relic from a bygone era. They became a reminder of the Puritan age that now seemed out of touch with a Sunday culture of leisure, sport, and shopping.
The demise of Sunday blue laws in this country, the real story is the triumph of commercialism. That car dealers insisted on the right to sell cars on Sunday. The mall stores, they were paying the same rent whether they were open or not.
While the Sunday sales restrictions are mostly gone, one of the outliers is Bergen County, New Jersey, just across from New York City. With a population of nearly 1 million people, Bergen County has kept Sunday sales laws on the books for centuries, and officials argue it has nothing to do with religion.
Paramus in the 50s said, look, we're going to allow for very large malls, which is something that was new to this country. In consideration of that, we're going to make sure that they're not open 7 days a week. And it works. And the thing I'd point out is that not only do we have so many malls, but it's some of the most successful malls in the country. On Sunday, it's the one day we could actually catch our breath and say, relax.
The citizens love the blue laws because it alleviates the traffic patterns on Sunday.
Some people have attacked the basis for it, and they've said it's based in religion, which may have started that way, but I've never associated our blue laws with religion. Granted, the roots might go back in history to religion, But at least here in Paramus, that's the day that's always worked for us. People want that Sunday off. The last time the voters had a chance to vote on the blue laws was back in the 80s, and I believe by a margin of 12-1, people wanted to keep their blue laws.
Yet for many, across the ages, Sabbath, or Shabbat, has come to mean something far more important than closing the shop.
The Sabbath doesn't come when you get home from work, finish cooking, go to the table, and then you begin the Sabbath. Sabbath comes with the sunset. The Sabbath arrives. We don't make it arrive.
My name is Daniel Singer. I'm the cantor at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. My title, cantor, is commonly known to be a musical term, but the original term for our profession is chazan. Chazan has the meaning of vision, a vision of worship and bringing light to people through music.
Shabbat begins as the sun sets Friday evening with prayer and song in the synagogue, ending with the blessing.
The blessing over the bread is a reminder of our connection to the earth. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, the drawing forth of bread from the earth.
And then each week, Cantor Singer returns home to welcome in Shabbat with his wife Lauren and their sons.
Nice. You want to light some candles then? I think we breathe a sigh of relief at the end of the week when we light the candles, and we just feel that kind of, it's good. Shabbos is here.
The magical transition from a weekday mentality to a Shabbat mentality begins with lighting the candles.
The candles themselves are so important. It says in the Bible that the souls of human beings are candles of God. Everything is made to be beautiful, because that's also part of the Sabbath.
Shabbat is not only for us, it's for our planet. It's for us to heal the world, heal ourselves. It's about smells, the smell of Shabbat. There's light on Shabbat with the candles. There's tastes with the wine, with the challah, the sustenance it brings us. And it reminds us of our connection to one another and to the earth.
Shabbat is a revolutionary concept. It actually changed human history. For the first time, it introduced the concept of mandated rest.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
At the morning Shabbat service, the community welcomes two young men for their bar mitzvahs.
Evan, as you know, this is symbolic of the transmission of our tradition from Sinai until now. It's about 3,500 years and counting. You're the next link in the chain.
First of all, a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah is a rite of passage. It marks the transition in Judaism from being a minor to being an adult of responsibilities in Judaism.
We mark the full recitation of the Torah by bringing out the Torah and dancing with it. We do that every Shabbat at Stephen Wise. We try to get everyone dancing.
We're going to be like Moses and Miriam and all the Israelites, and we're going to dance, and we're going to sing the same song they sang with timbrels in hand. And we sang this song.
They do appreciate the significance, the higher significance, the spiritual component of chanting Torah in front of the community and on behalf of the community for the first time.
Uvimlo yemei tahora levein olavat tavi keves ben shnato leola ulenyuna otor lochatat el petach o hamoed el hakohen v'hikrivo lifnei Adonai v'riper alecha.
Religion is supposed to inject in people a sense of awe, a sense of marvel, a sense of wonder, a sense of sanctity. All of those concepts we try and bring out on Shabbat. May God be with you all your days and grant you a lifetime of happiness, contentment, joy, creativity, and peace.
And then we are given over to continue the work of cultivating the world, sanctifying the world, and living within the divine order, that we don't undo this work of creation through our own human folly by placing ourselves within a spiritual consciousness of the Sabbath.
So we live in an industrial food system in which food just appears. We have no idea of its coming to be. We have no appreciation for its fragility, its vulnerability. But agricultural people have known from the beginning, you can't ever take food for granted, right? With a shopping experience, you don't have a moral obligation to what you purchase. It's mine. But when you're in a garden, when you're on a farm, if you're a hunter or a gatherer, you know that you live by receiving life rather than grasping and purchasing life. At the end of the day, food is a gift.
Farm plus seminary, smash it together, and you get farminary. So the farminary is a project at Princeton Theological Seminary, Princeton, New Jersey. And the big idea of the farminary is to integrate these two things, the farm and the seminary. So it's an integration of theological education, which is what typically happens at a seminary, and small-scale regenerative agriculture here at this 21-acre farm.
For these seminary students, many of whom will be the next generation of pastors and church leaders, the farminary is a hands-on way to confront deeper theological concerns that tie directly to the biblical story of creation.
We find ourselves living in the context of an exhausted world, a world that bears the wounds of extraction, exploitation, and alienation. What difference does faith make in an exhausted world?
Wasn't it you that said, I don't know how to listen to the land, not really? And I thought that was really a profound honesty.
So earthworms are a good sign. That means our soil's alive. I think about like limits, like limits to kind of the amount that we're able to take and making sure that's in proportion with what we're giving back to the ground. For me, the Sabbath principle here is not taking too much from the soil.
What better place than a working farm to experience up close nature's never-ending cycles of birth and rebirth, life and death.
They're so excited. Yeah, that's a little gruesome. If somebody with a glove wants to just pitch the chicken head into the woods somewhere, then it can feed other members of creation.
And the natural world can also be unpredictable and at times unforgiving. Hurricane Ida in the fall of 2021. The Northeast hoped it might escape.
But it just hammered us with rain. And so we had floodwaters up to here. You can see the watermark on the sign right here where it changes colors, and then it settled right there for a while. Water in all the buildings. We lost probably 125 chickens. All of the produce in the garden was rendered contaminated by FDA standards because it came in contact with floodwaters. The impulse, I think, is to we got to do something. We got to fix it. And I think the Sabbath invitation is, no, we probably just need to stop for a second.
There was something about soil that felt really deeply ancestral to me. And I think for people of my generation, let's stay away from that, because it also brings back that memory of that forced labor, that plantation labor on a farm. But I'm I feel like I need to reclaim that just for myself.
One of the things we have been painfully slow to recognize is that our exhaustion and the exhaustion of the broader creation are two sides of the same coin. The creation is exhausted because we don't know how to stop. There's not a single instance that I can find anywhere in Scripture where God gives Sabbath to an individual. It's always to the community, it's to the whole creation, it's to the gathering of God's people. Sabbath in all its fullness is an exercise of a community. The resources to accept this may not live inside of us. If they exist anywhere, it's only in relationship with ourselves, with the broader creation, with the Creator.
The most important Sabbath text, in my view, is the story in Genesis. God created, God completed, God rested on the seventh day and hallowed it.
And what does it mean that God rests? He likes the world. He's content.
The Sabbath is actually the key that unlocks the meaning and significance of everything that God's doing in those 6 days making the world. Because if you make a beautiful world, you still have to answer the question, why? And Shabbat answers that by saying, the point is to learn to love and delight in the goodness and the beauty that God has made. And the reason you do that is because that's what God did.
And yet out of that creation story came the harsh reality for the Israelites of years of enslavement by Pharaoh.
What we are told in the Exodus narrative is that Pharaoh kept imposing more and more severe work requirements on the Hebrew slaves. So it seems to me that the commandments of Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments and the Sabbath commandment, are provisions for how to live life beyond the requirements of Pharaoh.
But after centuries of captivity, the waters parted, and Moses led his people to freedom.
Let my people go. And one of the first things that you see being reinstituted there in the post-Exodus world of the Hebrews is this notion of Sabbath. Sabbath essentially becomes, for all persons in the Hebrew community, a memorial of freedom.
The rabbis would set about to codify what should be the structure of rest.
The rabbis propose in the Talmud 39 categories of work which are forbidden on the Jewish Sabbath. They're called 39 laws of Melacha. If you look at the work that was forbidden, it's threshing, plowing, reaping, tying, all kinds of things that a farmer would do.
All of the labors that were necessary to construct the tabernacle are forbidden on Shabbat.
But at its core, the laws of Shabbat were meant not only to cease from transforming the physical world, but to actively transform oneself.
I don't go to work. I have to dress differently. I have to walk differently. I have to speak differently. The rabbis emphasize that those are aspects of Sabbath behavior. It's arresting from constructive changes in the world. At the same time, it's allowing a space for spiritual consciousness to unfold.
When Jesus comes, he makes a big deal of the Sabbath, and he seems to have a preference for healing on the Sabbath, to deliver on the divine commitment, not divine commandment as maybe his critics think about the Sabbath, but as divine commitment. It's like he knows that he is inside a Sabbath story.
It's the perfect day because the miracles of Jesus are not just, they're not magic tricks. Watch me do something amazing. What he does is he heals people. He restores creation. And so it's altogether appropriate that he would do that work precisely on the Sabbath.
So rather than saying Jesus abolishes the Sabbath and all of the teachings of the Sabbath, I say what Jesus is doing in his ministries is helping us understand what would a Sabbath way of being look like when it encounters trouble, pain, suffering.
But when Jesus says in regard to himself that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, that's one of the most extraordinary claims he ever makes about himself. You can't say anything higher than that. In other words, he's saying, I'm not just one more prophet among many. I'm the Creator God.
But when Christ, who was a Sabbath-keeping Jew, leaves earth, those who followed faced a decision.
Do we remain a sect within Judaism, or do we differentiate ourselves? And the person who made that decision is Paul. And Paul consistently sought to differentiate what became Christianity from being a sect of Judaism.
Then we have the celebration of Christ's resurrection, which Scripture says happened on the first day of the week. So we think there's a practice where the first Christians who were Jewish were going to worship on the Sabbath. That was when they worshiped. And then on Sunday, they would have a Eucharist, have a feast, if you will, celebrate the resurrection of Christ.
Yet for the next several centuries, Christianity remained illegal throughout the Roman Empire, and acts of public worship could be severely punished. But in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted, and he transformed an ancient practice of honoring the sun god into the Christian Sabbath.
So Constantine was no fool, and he understood that if he was going to Christianize his nation, he had to kind of build it on a scaffold that already existed, not try to fight against the practice of the Roman Empire. So he sort of layered it onto, yes, a day that was set aside for the worship of the sun god, hence Sunday.
Embedded in all of this is the ethos that Jesus is coming back right now. And so each Sunday in this Christian movement became a little Easter. It became a memorial to Christ's death and resurrection, but more importantly, it was an urgency, an urgent gathering of prayer and study to bring about the second coming of Christ.
There are some 350,000 congregations in America. Congregations are critical infrastructure for community life in the United States, and they have been historically, they still are today. But a lot of congregations are struggling. They're small. I mean, some of the recent data says that the average congregation in the United States has only about 65 members. But congregations increasingly see themselves as going out into the communities, helping to meet needs, and seeing that as integral to their mission as much as they see filling the pews in their worship space.
Welcome to Jackson, Mississippi. It's a very historic city here. Many of the families that are located here in this area here that we're getting ready to drive through are located immediately around our local church here. We went door to door. We went through every street of this local community, and we did a community needs assessment. And as we knocked on each door and we asked the local residents that live here, what some of the needs were, the number one need that seemed to come up the most over and over again was a need for improved health resources, health services.
Glory, glory, glory. Hallelujah.
Father God, we thank you so much for this unique moment in time, this cathedral in time that you have stilled just for us. When we keep the Sabbath the way that God intended, by practicing righteousness, justice, and compassion toward those most in need, then the Bible helps us to understand that we will experience all of the blessings of Sabbath that God has fashioned into the day. So many of Jesus's miracles were performed on the Sabbath. And so we find that healing and health ministry on the Sabbath are beautifully aligned because they essentially reflect the healing ministry of Jesus.
And that is why this congregation, in addition to building a food pantry and a clothing center, has launched its own community health clinic and announced the opening on Sabbath during its annual health fair.
Every year for the last 4.5 years, we have had a health fair in order to reach out to our community, reconnect with persons who may have fallen out of the healthcare system, individuals who may not have access to healthcare.
Well, the church, from a cultural perspective in the Black community, has always been important. There is that element of trust. Well, the church was always the safe haven. It was the place where we could go, where we could get the correct information, we could be told the truth.
How long have you been a diabetic?
About 12 years.
Okay.
So you kind of know what you can and can't eat and what affects your sugar.
The overall health situation here in Jackson, Mississippi is pretty poor, to be completely honest. The things that were focused on here were prevention, such as for your diabetes, your high blood pressure, your various cardiovascular diseases, your cancer preventions. And I particularly focused on exercise. Some of them didn't necessarily realize the importance of exercise.
So that social justice orientation absolutely plays out in how people choose congregations, find congregations, and then also how congregations find people and find ways to connect to their communities.
There's a crisis happening in this neighborhood every day. When we keep the Sabbath the way that God intended, we will be practicing truth and love. We will become a church with a heart for the city. And our Sabbath worship experience will go from being a special day of worship just for us to a Sabbath for the city.
To look closely is to discover a Sabbath theme underlying so much of the American story, dating back to the beginnings.
One of the forces driving the Puritans from England to America was the opportunity to practice the Sabbath as strictly as they wanted. They felt that in England, it had become much too loose. There was drinking, there was dancing that was allowed on the Sabbath, and they didn't agree with that.
Most notoriously, King James I in the 16 teens had issued a book of sports where he permitted English people to, in free conscience, to engage in sporting activities on Sundays, which the Puritans didn't want to have happening at all. So they thought that not only is this just strictly unbiblical, but that it was, in effect, kind of inviting the judgment of God on England. And so the Puritans think we have a unique opportunity, almost unique in human history, to start over fresh and to see what it would be like to base a whole society on the moral law of God.
They were in church for 4 to 6 hours a day, even if it was really cold. They had laws on the books that said if you violate the Sabbath, you can be put in stocks, which usually didn't happen. Anybody engaging in commerce was violating the Spirit, because if your competitor was selling on the Sabbath, then you would probably feel the need to sell on the Sabbath, and you would lose that opportunity to enter the different order of time.
You take care of the poor, you're responsible to your neighbor, and you don't provoke God by violating the Sabbath. Starting in about the 1790s, there is an outbreak nationally of what we generally call the Second Great Awakening in America. And this is a massive increase in religious adherence. And that's the time when you see especially the Baptist and the Methodist denominations come to the fore. And it's really, in a way, the most remarkable time of Christian growth in all of American history.
But there is a parallel story, because this was still a time when slavery was legal in many states. And while the majority of the slaveholders were Sabbath-keeping Christians, a Sabbath day of rest for those they enslaved was never guaranteed.
It should not be lost on us that these folks who practiced the Sabbath did not necessarily or always extend those rights to the people who worked in their households. And we could argue, in fact, that their observance of the Sabbath was supported by those folks who worked in their households.
One of the sad ironies in 18th century America comes in the form of the Philadelphia Liberty Bell. Carved into it is the saying, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof." It's taken from the book of Leviticus, referring to the Sabbath idea of a Jubilee year, when according to biblical practice, all slaves are to be set free.
Every living creature is entitled to rest on Shabbat. We even have a concept in the Bible of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee years that are connected to Shabbat. The sabbatical year is every 7 years. There's a year of rest. And then On the 7th of the 7th year, the 49th year, there's a year of rest, and then there's a Jubilee year on the 50th year. It's the Sabbath of Sabbaths.
Yet for African Americans held in bondage, somehow the idea of a Jubilee year, a year to be set free, rarely comes to pass.
There was a debate in the antebellum period about the morality of slavery in general, of course, and critics of slavery in America often pointed to the Jubilee expectations about freedom for slaves and criticized American slavery for being perpetual. And they said, well, you say you're Christians, but you're not attempting to observe the Jubilee regulations about freedom after 7 years for the slaves. I am not aware of instances where Christian slave masters decided to free their slaves after 7 years because of the Jubilee regulations.
On different plantations, people were able to worship. Often there was what we would call the official worship, right? So that there would be a slave preacher who would come and essentially say to the slaves, slaves, obey your masters and you'll go to heaven. But I think one of the most powerful things that enslaved people did was worship on their own. To sneak out into the woods late at night after working 12, 14, 16-hour days, to worship freely in what they called the hush arbors or the brush arbors, to call out on their God on their own terms.
And so in a lot of ways, Sabbath was the one day that they experienced some dimension or element of freedom. They had a freedom to worship the God of their fathers, the God of their ancestors, and to call out to him together in corporate solidarity.
At the dawn of the 20th century, as the rights of workers began gaining ground, labor unions and Sabbath proponents found support in each other.
The labor union movement was usually very supportive of the idea of workers having Sundays off because they were so committed to the idea of limiting the maximum hours of work for individual workers. So in many ways, the labor movement in America is a surprisingly religious story, and it does often converge at the issue of Sabbath.
But that was for Sunday Sabbath observers. For those whose faith called them to honor a day other than Sunday, it could be a very different reality.
For the Jewish people, it is not an option. It's a commandment. And in many cases, Jews gave up their jobs, even gave up their lives, rather than violate the Sabbath.
And into the 20th century, Black people continued to turn to the church and the Sabbath observance as sanctuary from legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws.
So that over time, church for Black people became everything. This is the place where I'm not wearing a uniform. So for some people, dressing up on Sunday was a huge deal. You weren't wearing whatever you had to wear to work in someone's house. In worship or in church on Sunday, African Americans had dignity. They not only got to dress up, but someone who was a nameless, faceless worker out there in a field somewhere got to be deacon so-and-so. And he got to sit up front and have a role of authority and assume a role that he could not ordinarily. So people who had to make their way through the world with their heads down and their shoulders hunched over got to sit up straight.
We had Black churches because Black people were not allowed into the white churches. But it became a place of community, a place to be loved. So the Black church that's a part of our history, but it's also a part of who we are right now. I never had a right understanding of the Sabbath, ever. I never thought much about it. I never applied it to my life. All of that came to me recently, and I've been pastoring 34 years.
Jeffrey Johnson is senior pastor at Eastern Star Baptist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. Eastern Star has 3 large church locations, about 20 miles apart. So every Sunday, Pastor Johnson rises early and drives from church to church to church. It's precisely timed to arrive at each site just in time to deliver the sermon to thousands in the pew and online. He's been doing it for over 30 years, and this Sunday is Easter, Resurrection Sunday.
want us to understand the reality of the resurrection. That it is not some metaphor. It's not some allegory. It's not some illustration. Jesus literally died. He physically got up. That God did raise Jesus from the dead. I like the different locations. And I don't mind the driving. But in that 25 minutes, I'm editing the sermon. But it's not just peace with God. We have the peace of God. Well, Pastor, what is the peace of God? That means whatever's going on around you, all hell could be breaking loose around you. But inside of you, there is calmness. You have this coolness.
This morning, started me on my way.
On a normal Sunday between the 3 worship services, I'm probably going to hear anywhere from 15 to 20 gospel songs between those 3 services. But you need to know, I'm the only one at my church that can't sing. Everybody at East Star Church has the gift of singing. I got pulled over one time by the police, and I'm moving, you know, and he pulled me over, and I said, "Officer, I'm just trying to get to these services." He said, "Pastor, can you just slow down? That's all." And he left me alone. The people out in Fishers, Indiana, they're not necessarily wealthy, but they're not struggling to pay their mortgage. And that's different from in Arlington Woods, when you got people making $25,000 a year trying to raise 3 kids. Now, Lord, you know what each person is going through. You know what we're up against. You know what's happening in our lives.
So after 3 decades of pastoring and a discernment process of 10 years, Pastor Johnson, along with his wife Sharon, committed to taking a sabbatical.
The way I came into taking a sabbatical was listening to other pastors, some of my friends, some I would say my mentors, and just hearing their take on the Sabbath. And for some of them, it was the negative. I never took one. And I saw what not taking one did to them. I had not seen it modeled in front of me. I have not heard anybody put emphasis on it. So before I left, I spent a year preaching and teaching. Then we had to prepare the staff, and we prepared the congregation so that when I left, they were ready for it. So we spent a month in a mountain, and then my wife and I spent a month on a rural beach. And then the last month, we had our family to come and spend time with us. When I was gone for 6 months, our staff, they went from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week. And so to give them additional rest as well.
And after 6 months, the Johnsons returned.
Good morning, everybody. Glad you're back. You look well rested.
I was glad when they said unto me, "Let us go into the house of the Lord." Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name, my soul. These are the homes that we built. We provided the land and the volunteers, and Habitat for Humanity came in these 2.
The neighborhood around the main church is the very community where Pastor Johnson was born.
This has been a community that has been one of the most economically deprived communities, not just in Indianapolis, not just in the state of Indiana, in the nation. And so you talk about a food desert, an economical desert, an employment desert, an educational desert, a financial desert. And so now we're starting to make a difference in this community.
And by pulling together support from across the community, Eastern Star has opened its own grocery store and the New Rock Community Center that will care for and educate young people throughout the area.
You can change a neighborhood, but you got to do it 1 block at a time. We can't change all of Indianapolis, so we're going to do a mile radius to start. We worship together, we praise God together, we serve together, and we rest together, we Sabbath together.
I'll tell you this story. We were at a hotel for Shabbat. And we made all the arrangements with the hotel, telling them that we can't use the electronic doors and the elevators and escalators. But one of the staff, one of the rabbis, ended up in a room on the 12th floor. So he has to take the steps. He can't use the elevator or the escalator. And then he has an electronic door, and he can't use that either. So he asks one of the staff members to meet him on the 12th floor and open the door for him. So the staff member takes the elevator to the 12th floor, and he climbs 12 flights of stairs, and he meets him at the door. And the rabbi is totally exhausted. So the staff member says, "What is it about today that you can't open the door?" And the rabbi says, "Well, today is our day of rest."
I'm really compelled by what Pope Francis says about the Sabbath. And Pope Francis says that if you have the right to work, you also have the right to rest. And as a community organizer, as a Latino Catholic, I am concerned, as the Pope is, about the things that get in the way of people's ability to practice Sabbath. Because more and more our economy is designed to keep people in a constant state of work just in order to survive.
America has always been classically a nation of immigrants, but immigrants have always also been disproportionately religious. You're in an unfamiliar place, you look for people who are like you, who have common values, and that story endures through present-day America.
If you look at the entire church in the U.S., both Protestant and Catholic together, or even Orthodox, the percentage of those believers, of those Christians that are Latino is about 22, 23%. In the Catholic Church, it's double that. 40% of all Catholics in the U.S. right now are Latino, are Hispanic. The younger you go, the more Hispanic it gets. The Latino population is growing very, very quickly, but the great irony in this is that that's also the group that's leaving the church the fastest.
In downtown Los Angeles, across the street from the historic City Plaza, is Our Lady Queen of Angels Catholic Church. Because of its long association with the square, the church has come to be known as La Placita, the Little Plaza.
La Placita is a landmark. It's a landmark in many ways. Not only is it one of the oldest churches in California, but it's a place where people still come to continue their faith. This is where they bring their children.
La Placita is a significant part of Los Angeles history. And to this day, it continues to be kind of a place of migration, a place of refuge and rest, a place of community.
Most of the people that we have in our congregation are Hispanic people. Most of them are Mexicans from different areas, and especially from Guatemala and El Salvador.
Outside on the church wall is the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, one of the most iconic religious images in the Western world. For many, it's the first stop on the way to Sunday Mass.
And I think the people who worship at La Placita carry all kinds of burdens and all kinds of hopes as people who are either immigrants themselves or are not that far removed from the story of their families being immigrants, which is to have one foot in one world and another foot in this world, in this city of Los Angeles. I think it is the case that immigrants, Latino Catholics, identify with the story of Exodus, the story of the Israelites wandering the desert for 40 years under a brutal empire dictated by Pharaoh. And I think there's a role for the church in helping people connect back to the story of a people who collectively cried out to God in their suffering.
Weekends at La Placita will mean 8 masses, all in Spanish, and half of them celebrated by Father Arturo. and it's not unusual to perform as many as 60 baptisms over several days.
What we're savoring there is eternal life. What we're savoring is this new life in Christ. These children are brought into the mystical body of Jesus. Of course, it's hyper appropriate on a Sabbath day.
The rubrics of the liturgy of baptism actually call for, wherever possible, baptisms to happen in the context of the Sunday liturgy. The Sabbath, from a Catholic perspective, is so meaningful, and why it should happen in Sundays, because that's when the community tends to be there. And you're not only just being baptized into Christ, but you're being baptized into this broader community.
We try to keep one Mass with a mariachi at all times. There's nothing more cultural to the Hispanic community than to hear a Mass with a mariachi.
La Placida offers a window into the Sabbath story at the intersection of the Old World and the New America.
Coming to Mass on Sunday is something mandatory if you're a Catholic. Your parents teach you this. On Sunday, you go to church. You think of Sunday as a day to go worship God, thank God. And it's something that families have done for generations.
And so the drawback of growing up in that really deeply woven Latino culture is that some of the aspects of the faith can be very cultural, very much about a family custom, or this is just the way we do it. But there's not the kind of intellectual grappling with, well, what are we doing? And why are we doing it?
Many of the people who go to La Placita are there as people who are workers. They're laborers. They work in the service and entertainment industry. They work in restaurants. They're the people who are the backbone of our economy.
Most of the people who are coming to our parish are workers. When they receive communion, they extend the hands, and most of the hands are worker hands.
El domingo es para cantar. El domingo es para descansar. El domingo es para tener a la familia tranquila y no jalarlo para todos lados.
Some other people needs to hear stories of salvation because they are struggling with some stories in family and the society, and they find also a point of reference through the readings.
There's a lot of people that the church has become their family, and that's where they eat. They eat out in the courtyard after Mass or before Mass, and it's just part of what Sunday means to us.
Part of what we've seen in the Catholic parish landscape in particular is Catholics increasingly taking ownership over where they want to go to church and what that experience looks like. And there's data on Catholics driving farther and farther to get to a parish where they feel at home, where they feel like they can rest. And oftentimes that means at home among others that they feel comfortable around.
As Hispanic people, most of the time we arrive a little late for celebration. And I saw when I'm already inside of the church celebrating how many people are arriving and struggling with the kids because they are late. And there is a transformation at the end of the Mass that at the end, the families go in peace.
So the question during the Sabbath is not, what should I do? And in many ways, I think that's the question for us as a society. It's not, what should we do to solve all of the inequalities and injustices in the world around us? But who do we need to become?
Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work.
But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work.
You, your son or your daughter, not your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns.
כי ששת שמים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ.
And the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day.
That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
WHO has been in full response mode since we were notified of the first cases. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
As the crisis sweeps the nation, the toll is growing by the hour.
I can still remember the week we heard that this thing called COVID was about to hit us and we were going to have to shut church down. I went out into our courtyard here and I taped an announcement for our people and I said, we'll get back to you next week because maybe we'll just miss a week. Shows you the utter naivete.
There was a time when every parish, for the first time in American history, every parish was closed at some point during COVID, which had never happened before.
The abrupt ceasing of our labors, our work, our school, the stay-at-home orders was in and of itself a Sabbath, right? We had to step out of mundane, ordinary time in order to step into something totally different that we didn't even have language for yet.
What COVID did was impact both the weekly prayer routine, in which people also pray in community, but particularly the Sabbath. The isolation of COVID became an isolation of each person's spiritual life.
I think that the COVID-19 pandemic was a real clarion call for churches, that we could not take for granted the things that we had always taken for granted, and we had to very, very quickly reinvent ourselves.
Catholic worship is very communitarian. It's very Eucharistic, and it involves the community coming together to eat and drink the body and blood of Jesus, and that can't be done through a camera.
We do, of course, have the role of technology and social media in ways that we probably never anticipated before. And some would say that that builds and fosters a particular kind of community, and I think that there's evidence for that. But other sociologists have called that essentially a form of being alone together.
Somebody said that you can sit around and cry over this technology, or you can adjust to it and learn how to use it.
But in other forms of being together too, like weddings and funerals, suddenly we take away our ability to mourn together, to celebrate together, and we create new norms around that.
The data, unfortunately, indicate that a lot of people are either not going to come back or going to come back less often.
I believe people are going to come back to church. I believe that. And people are starting to come back to church. And I believe that it is going to be that hybrid moving forward.
And I think in many ways, the pandemic was an invitation to examine our lives and to review and reflect on whether or not we were actually living before the pandemic. Were we living an authentic life, or were we just crazy busy running from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, taking our time and our health and our gatherings and our Sabbath practices all for granted?
St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts, is home to a community of Trappist monks who gather 7 times a day for communal prayer. Their daily life is guided by the rule of St. Benedict, the 6th century saint whose rule has provided direction and a rhythm for monastic life for 1,500 years.
The life rests on 3 pillars, and those 3 pillars are prayer, work, and reading. It begins at 3:30 in the morning and it goes through 8 o'clock at night.
The chant that we now call Gregorian was developed between the 9th and 11th centuries in Europe, in monasteries throughout Europe. All the chants originally were sung by memory, and that originated with the synagogues. The early Christians went to the synagogue, naturally, so they knew the music, the hymns, the psalms, brought that into the Christian liturgy.
And foundational to daily life is the Benedictine expression handed down through the ages, ora et labora, pray and work. Here, prayer takes priority, and all work has value.
The monastery depends on the labor of the monks for its daily running, for its upkeep. So monks cook, clean, do the laundry, grow vegetables. That's all part of our daily life.
Ora et labora, which kind of sums up the Benedictine ideal. What's important is, in what spirit do you embrace that work? You see, that's where the spiritual connects with the practical, with the necessary. All work is important if it is a service done for your brothers and sisters. So there's nothing too sublime and there's nothing too menial.
Certainly, the Trappists themselves were totally agricultural for such a long time. I would say it's only become like in the last 30 years where you find the monasteries shifting significantly to mechanized operations.
All Benedictine monasteries strive to be self-sufficient, to live by their works. This community supports itself primarily on small industry, the making of incense, the creation of clergy vestments, and since the 1950s, the production of their own brand of Trappist preserves. Yet all work stops when the bells call the brothers to prayer.
So we have this automatic readjust. If you can follow it, it's a very good discipline.
Even with a discipline that calls the brothers to pray throughout the day, Sunday Sabbath is special.
For us, Sunday begins on Saturday evening in a ritual way with Vespers, and it all point to this being a special day.
In the Christian tradition, the Jewish Sabbath of rest and repose kind of merges with the day of resurrection. You arise earlier to meet the risen Christ and to praise God in the risen Christ. That's an essential part of the Christian Sabbath.
For Catholics, Sunday is centered around the celebration of the Mass.
We're not in a rush. We really take our time with the liturgy. I usually tell the people, well, we don't have any place to go. This is where we are, where I live. This is our life here. And we have the time to enjoy it.
So what really helps for the communal celebration of Sabbath when you're living a cenobitic or communal life is that the energy level and rhythm and collateral noise of the place really goes down. And so you can hear that it's the Sabbath.
We don't make an explicit statement, we come here so that we can keep Sabbath better together. No, but that's understood because the whole way of life is kind of sabbatical.
Actually, St. Benedict gets very detailed. He says between these hours and these hours, we want the brothers to be occupied in what we call Lectio Divina, which is reading of spiritual texts.
We're talking 6th century St. Benedict, the rule. Most people were illiterate. why were monks not illiterate? And we know from just reading history that monasteries become centers of learning and all that. I mean, we all know that. But why? So that they could read the scripture. So that in fact, the Sabbath prescription and Benedict, that they may devote themselves more wholeheartedly to sacred reading. It requires learning how to read, and it creates a culture of the Bible, and therefore of letters. And the activity of reading and meditating and praying, which is the heart of the Christian observance of the Sabbath.
So every Sunday, the community gathers to listen to the abbot. The abbot is the spiritual father of the community. Sunday, I think, is the moment for us to return to the essentials of our life.
I always think of St. Augustine's saying from the Confessions that I cannot rest, Lord, unless I rest in you.
Seems to me that God is calling us to deepen our appreciation of this Sunday rest.
And so the Sabbath is really the day that we remember who we are and we remember who God is. It's the day to renew both our humanity and our purpose and our relation to the whole creation.
In the 1970s, a psychology professor from Princeton University and a PhD student from Princeton Seminary devised their own experiment in human behavior that would come to be known as the Good Samaritan Project.
And they managed to divide a group of Princeton Seminary students into 3 groups, and they gave them a task across campus. And they knew that all of these students were familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, and so theoretically they would be predisposed to helping somebody in need.
They gave them all personality tests, and then they split them into 3 groups. They said to one group, you have plenty of time to get there, don't worry, it's in an hour. And they said to another group, it's pretty soon, you gotta move on, you're okay, you're gonna make it. And they said to another group, you're late, get over there right away.
The real test was that these researchers had positioned an actor along the way who was kind of in this alleyway, appeared to be having a medical situation.
They wanted to know how many people from each group would stop and help this man, or at least ask what was wrong.
And they tested for personality, they tested for their familiarity with this parable, but the only predictor of whether they stopped to help this person was whether or not they were in a hurry. And the more they were in a hurry, the less likely they were to stop and help the person.
So they concluded from that being in a hurry undermines your altruism, your ethical sense.
And it's difficult to care for things that we're just zooming by. And to bring it back to the Sabbath, I think the Sabbath is like, wait, stop. Let this impact your pace of life.
He would spark our imagination by describing Sabbath as a cathedral in time. That depiction comes from the acclaimed writer Abraham Joshua Heschel in his classic work, The Sabbath.
I think the emphasis is on the word time. That is, my father spoke about the extraordinary cathedrals built all over Europe by the church. Beautiful, beautiful buildings. Jews don't have that. We didn't build cathedrals, buildings. Instead, we built a cathedral out of time. Shabbat is our cathedral.
Now, time became sacred long before space became sacred. Like, for example, in the days of Noah, in the days of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, there was no holy place. No place was holy. Time was.
Why did my father write the Sabbath? Because he came to America and he saw the Jews had abandoned the Sabbath, and they didn't even realize what it was they had abandoned, what they had lost in their lives.
Well, I would attribute to Heschel's influence a transition in the thinking of many Adventists from Sabbath keeping to the Sabbath experience. I think Heschel's contribution to our thinking on the Sabbath was to enhance the sense that this is a day to live life at its fullest.
And part of living to the fullest means living without those things some believe only distract.
We didn't use electricity, and we didn't cook. We didn't use the phone. We certainly didn't listen to the radio or television. We didn't go to the store, of course, or use money. It's hard for me to actually identify what it was that we didn't do because it was so much a part of the natural rhythm. On Shabbat, we didn't talk about politics. We didn't talk about things that were divisive or depressing or horrifying. We didn't talk about the atrocities in Vietnam. We didn't talk about the Holocaust. Those were not compatible with the atmosphere of Shabbat. So instead, we talked about happy things.
I heard Heschel only a time or two, but I heard him say that Sabbath was the day he didn't need to prove that he was a good rabbi. Isn't that a wonderful statement?
The book was not particularly popular at the time. Keep in mind that most Jews in those days, after World War II in America, most Jews assumed that Jewish religious observance was over. No one expected what we have today, which is an enormous flourishing of Orthodox Judaism.
In traditional terms, people wouldn't say, are you Orthodox or are you observant? When a traditional person wants to know if a person is observant, they say, are you a Shomer Shabbos Jew? That means, do you observe the Sabbath? That becomes the defining term of whether that person is trustworthy or observant in traditional terms. So it's a defining quality of what is that person is a Sabbath person.
There's a famous saying, more than Jews have kept the Shabbos has kept the Jews.
So Shabbat is more of the modern Hebrew way of saying it, and Shabbos is the ancient Hebrew way of saying it. I lived here in Crown Heights my whole life. I've studied abroad a little bit, but always coming back home to Crown Heights. And growing up in that environment where everyone is family, practically, as in everyone is there for each other. So prayer is the way that we start off our day. Every day in the morning, start off with a morning prayer. And the best way to do that, the optimal way to doing that is in the synagogue with a group of 10 men that would make up the minyan, and that's a time of reconnecting to God.
The Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, New York, is home to one of the largest communities of Hasidic Orthodox Jews in the world. 770 Eastern Parkway is the headquarters and synagogue for a movement within the Hasidic tradition known as Chabad Lubavitch.
The people at the prayer are the entire community. The lawyers, the doctors, the businessmen, the blue-collar workers, they're all there.
A lot of them are students that are here to pray. A lot of them are all walks of life. This is the central synagogue where people just keep on coming constantly to come and pray.
This daily prayer service offers a sense of the Saturday Shabbos service, because according to conservative and Orthodox traditions, no filming can take place on Shabbos.
Shabbos looks very similar to the weekday in the type of setup that you have. And even during the weekday, we don't use microphones, so that would be the same on Shabbos and on the weekday. On Shabbos, just people wouldn't be wearing tefillin, because tefillin is supposed to help you remember God and to be a sign on your arm and on your head. And on Shabbos, you don't need that extra reminder. You don't need that sign. Shabbos itself is that sign.
You want to show the observance of Shabbat on film, but we're not allowed to film on Shabbat. See, that's how personal the Shabbat has to be. It's now I'm focused on what is needed from me. No intrusion on that. No cameras, no no media, no electronics, no machinery. So you might even say that Shabbat is a day for intimacy, whereas during the 6 days of the week, public time.
About 10% of American Jews identify as Orthodox, and studies show they're attracting a younger demographic.
Orthodox Jews are Jews that are following the laws of the Torah and not deviating or changing those laws. They're staying true to the original laws, the original text. But there are a lot of laws to being an Orthodox Jew. So the Hasidic movement came to help bring you to the table, bring your personality along. A classic piece of Hasidic Judaism is excitement and joy, because when you're in a relationship with God, that's very exciting.
The essence of Shabbos is, for 6 days of the week, I worry about what needs to be taken care of. I have to survive, I have to exist, I have to improve my existence. But for 24 hours of Shabbos, my existence is not important, it's not a concern. Now you focus on why you're alive, not how you're alive. So the essential word for Shabbat is not rest. It's a poor definition, a poor translation. The real word is contentment. If you're really experiencing Shabbos, you're experiencing a true contentment.
On weekday afternoons, the same space becomes a busy, vibrant study hall.
During the study times when everyone's sitting and studying and arguing and debating between each other. Here in 770, there's a 7-year cycle of different things that we learn every year, different tractates of the Talmud. And this year happened to be the tractate of Shabbat, of Shabbos. And you can see everyone whose books are open, they're studying Shabbos, all the laws of Shabbos, from the original source, from the text in the Talmud. The way that we study is with a chavrusa, it's called, which means a study partner or a friend, where you sit across and everyone's sitting across from each other, studying together. And the two minds together work with each other and challenge each other to better understand and to challenge each other on what one opinion is. So, for example, they'll be studying an argument of the sages from 2,000 years ago in the Talmud. And each one of the rabbis has differing opinion. And then as you're studying it, you have an opinion of what you think it means, and your partner has an opinion of what you think it means. And then you guys are arguing. So you're arguing over what they were arguing about 2,000 years ago.
What seems beyond any argument here is that Shabbos is more than a wise health practice.
The idea of rest can be very selfish. I need a day off. I need a break. I'm not changing really. For 6 days, I do what I need to make money. On the 7th day, I do what I need to relax, to recuperate. It's still just me and my needs.
I don't want to use the word stress because then it makes it sound like Shabbos is a time to fix your stress problem. Shabbos is not a time to fix your stress problem. Stress is for the 6 days of the week. Shabbos is a day where stress shouldn't exist.
There was also what I call the Romantic Sabbath. So there were Romantic writers like Rousseau, Wordsworth, who began to write about the beauty and importance of unstructured time, of time outside time. And that was not a religious concept. It was a poetic and romantic concept. So it was moving away in the 19th century from this Puritan idea of a Sabbath in which biblical notions are put into practice and you are close to God, to something that was cultural, personal. The writer who to me best captures the Romantic Sabbath is actually not considered one of the Romantic writers, but D.H. Lawrence. His heroine, whose name is Ursula Brangwyn, sadly contemplates the disappearance of what she calls the old duality of life. Even at its stormiest, Sunday was a blessed day. Ursula woke to it with a feeling of immense relief. She wondered why her heart was so light. Then she remembered it was Sunday. A gladness seemed to burst out around her, a feeling of great freedom. The whole world was for 24 hours revoked, put back. Only the Sunday world existed.
When I was growing up, some of the don't do's really didn't make sense. For example, we could go hiking on Sabbath but not swimming. We could wade but not get in fully into the water. We could climb trees, but we couldn't do too much running too fast. It was common, in fact. After Sabbath lunch, we'd have people over, friends, kids our age. We'd get done eating quick, and we'd push away from the table and want to go outside. And there was always this statement, kids, remember, it's Sabbath. And we're like, okay, what does that mean? We run half as fast, swing half as high, laugh half as loud.
My experience as a Sabbath keeper throughout my life has been a preoccupation with what it is not appropriate to do on a Sabbath can be a distraction from the possibility of the day as a day of personal fulfillment.
Happy Sabbath. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Randy Roberts is senior pastor at Loma Linda University Church, a Seventh-day Adventist community about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. The church is at the center of a large hospital and medical campus. Adventists are Christians, and as a church they are committed to Saturday Sabbath keeping, believing the Bible calls them to honor the seventh day of the week, not the first. That weekly day of Sabbath rest, along with a focus on a healthy diet and exercise, all contribute to why Adventists are considered some of the healthiest people in America.
Fairly early in our history, Adventists became interested and concerned about health. Our physical lives matter, and so we ought to care for them. So fairly on, that became an emphasis, and it has continued to be. And at least according to different studies, it indicates that it has paid off. I think Sabbath contributes profoundly to that.
Of course, the Sabbath is a way to orchestrate time in a way and make us walk in step at least one day a week where we might function as a community and might meet each other as a community.
Are you a person of peace? It's an important question for us to wrestle with. It's not just something we put on at will. It's something that Paul says the Holy Spirit weaves into the fabric of our lives. I think what Paul is saying is, whatever circumstances you face, you can make choices to be glad, to be gracious, to be grateful. And when you do that, he says, you will have a peace that no one can explain.
Just across the courtyard from Loma Linda's main sanctuary is an example of a significant shift in American church practice. In addition to the traditional Sabbath worship, they offer a more contemporary experience to reach a different, hopefully younger audience.
Well, we're doing this just because culture has shifted, culture has changed, and our conviction is if we're going to be able to speak into a new culture, we have to speak in different ways, in different forms, different styles.
While the setting is very different, the message preached remains the same.
Are you a person of peace?
The church stepping out beyond these walls, tear them down. We are the fire, we're bringing it out. Moving like no tomorrow.
A group of us here are reading a book right now by a leader down at Fuller Seminary named Scott Cormode, and his premise is the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And if we don't recalibrate and make changes, we will disappear.
Providing an experience where young people feel comfortable seems more than appropriate. It seems vital. Sabbath offers a clear reminder of how people often tend to gather within their own groupings, whether by race, culture, or age.
And so this sort of inclination that many Americans have to be together with others like themselves certainly is helpful in the sense of building bonds of community and familiarity. But it also has some potentially really negative effects, which effectively means that we are filtering our experience of reality and of each other. And we are essentially building communities that look like mirrors.
And here in this community are Sabbath practices that extend well beyond the worship service.
And I'm interested in now a day of devotion and not just a couple hours at church and then come home and take care of my other responsibilities, but a whole day to do that. So there's been a revival, we might say, or a regeneration of interest on the part of Christians in a whole day.
Why shouldn't the preparation of a meal be an expression of worship? Does that not honor God when we make a good meal?
We thank you so much for everything that you've given us. We are so, so blessed.
We're so grateful to come out and be able to celebrate your Sabbath together here.
For many in this greater Loma Linda community, the Sabbath practice continues after worship with gatherings at home with family and friends.
We do this every Sabbath, whether it's just our immediate family or our extended family. It's not unusual if we had 30 or more. In fact, that's kind of little. Everyone brings a dish. It's almost like it's Thanksgiving every Sabbath.
Sabbath with our family was always with other families. And so what you see today with all of our other friends, that's what our parents did, and that's what we saw as kids. That's what we hope our kids see also.
Saturday to me is the best day off. I get to take a break, just spend time away from studies.
The University of California at Berkeley is one of the more academically competitive environments in the country. For students raised practicing a weekly Sabbath, a full day away from study now presents a challenge.
One thing that's really changed about my experience is kind of balancing the real world with the Sabbath that I traditionally knew growing up. Since coming to Berkeley, it became a lot more personal, so I had to find out what I was doing individually rather than kind of being carried along by my family. And I would say it actually grew stronger because I was doing things because I was searching for them rather than just kind of knowing and accepting that it was the way I believed things should be.
When I was still back at my parents' place, the environment I was in was very focused on Saturday. My school itself had events on Fridays that we would go to, and then Saturday we'd go to church. But since I've come up here and being independent, I don't really have to have that requirement. I will come to church here, but other times I'll just take a day off for myself and either go into the woods and just relax a little bit, because for me Sabbath is a lot more about rest. Would like to continue to observing if possible. The keyword is if possible. So I'm sure God understands if I have a test or something.
Life Adventist Church is adjacent to the university, and many who attend the church are students. Ron Piquel has been pastor here for more than 20 years.
The spiritual challenge for students on a campus like this is, well, for one thing, they're away from home. It kind of make decisions pretty quickly. Was this just my parents' faith? They either really go deeper in their faith because they start to own it as their own, or they walk away.
For many of these students, this is the time to make their own discoveries and decisions about Sabbath.
More than it being a 24-hour period from sunset to sunset, I just think it's like this intentional moment. I try my best to avoid doing homework on Sabbath, but since coming here, that's sometimes just not an option. That was a big change from my life growing up to here. Never ever did homework on Saturdays, and then I came here and I was like, I don't have that opportunity anymore. I gotta get some things done. But to the best of my ability, I do just try to take a step back, have a relaxed day.
Sabbath begins for us on a Friday evening. Not a lot of ritual or liturgy with that. They have a meal together and then a Bible study or discussion time. That's an opportunity for their world on campus to kind of connect with their faith.
I knew that the Sabbath was a special time because of the way that my parents structured their life and career around it.
I think God sort of resting on the seventh day is part of that conversation of saying, like, I could keep creating forever, but at some point, sometimes you just have to stop.
Earlier on in my PhD, there was some pressure to like do things on Friday nights or Saturdays, but I mean, I decided to draw that line. Some people got upset, but I mean, that's just my personal value. Sabbath is important. I like my rest. I like my time to go to church and spend time with community, with the friends that I've grown to love these past 6 years.
Not far from the church is People's Park, a site for Berkeley's growing homeless. Part of the Sabbath practice is to prepare a warm meal for them.
We came here on Sabbath because we really feel that Saturday should be a day that we take apart from the usual worries of the week, where we tend to focus really on ourselves. During the Sabbath, we should remove that and focus on other people, and then also spend time among nature as we are here in this beautiful park.
Hello, sir. Would you care for a meal?
For me personally, I consider myself a very energetic person. So my rest is kind of just refocusing my energy from my schoolwork, from my job. Just make sure that you are taking on that peace that the Sabbath is supposed to be all about.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Muslims do not speak in terms of Sabbath or a day of rest for themselves or for God, but the Friday Jummah prayer has many similarities.
In the Quran, there's a command that tells practitioners of Islam that when the call to Jummah is made, the day of Friday, and here it's in specific speaking about the Friday prayer, that you should hasten to answer that call, leaving behind even your work in order to respond to it. The word Jummah is rooted in an Arabic root that means to bring people together.
And Friday has been chosen by God for a specific reason, because according to the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, he says that Friday is the best day that the sun has risen. It is the day that Adam was created. It is the day that Adam was exiled from paradise, and it is the day that he died. And the day of resurrection will be established on no other day except Friday.
The day of Jummah is meant to be opportunity now for people to traditionally leave everything that they have, their workplaces that are quite often segmented, the marketplace that is very much divided on social class, aspects of society that are heavily stratified, and you walk into a place, nobody is given specific designation because of their level of affluence, the amount of wealth that they have. Contentment is not attached to being in a space where you own many things around you. ليس الغنى عن كثرة الأرض ولكن الغنى غنى النفس. The true richness is not having an abundance of things of the earth, but true richness is having a richness of your soul.
Being an NYU student, you kind of have a lot of responsibilities every day, every week. You see, we have a bunch of backpacks kind of all over on the corner, right? You quite literally take off the baggage from the week, put it off into the corner, right? And kind of just use this hour 15, hour and a half for me to speak with God.
What is the act of beauty that's going to come from me today? Who am I going to be a source of light for? How am I going to replenish and rejuvenate myself? Do acts of charity. Be a reason that people have hope in this world, not the reason that people dread it. What you would find in many communities in the 14th century lived tradition of Islam was smaller mosques that people would pray their daily prayers in. And you'd have typically in a locale a much larger mosque that was now the Friday mosque. So people would leave their villages, they'd leave, their home cities, and they'd come to frequent here, everybody coming from all corners of the space to pray in this one larger gathering.
How we prepare ourselves for Jummah. There's like a whole ritual where we make wudu, like do ablution. We come in like our best clothes or come in like our cleanest clothes and come into this space and prepare ourselves with like reciting scripture. And then afterwards, students go out and do like community service-based projects. Some students go back to their communities.
Jummah has the potential of being, for a lot of people, a moment to just pause and reflect. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him and upon all those who choose to tread in his path until the last day. We have a verse in the Quran that says, "Indeed, in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest." Give us hearts that feel joy whenever any one of us succeeds, and the love and hope needed to celebrate that achievement. Give us hearts that are not lost in the pursuit of this world.
It's a moment of just celebration and rest, but also it's a moment of clarity and reflection, because a lot of the times, especially like living here and in the city, it can get really overwhelming.
And when you don't sit down to rest, you don't have like a wellness strategy that tells you that it's okay to take a pause and to breathe, it's gonna start catching up to you. And you're going to now see the world and process reality through the prism of that exhaustion.
The essence of the Sabbath is not what we get out of it, but how we treat the world differently. All the things that you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath according to Jewish ritual law are things that are creative acts that transform the world around us in some way. And so we're letting the world rest. The world has to rest from us. It's not just us resting from ourselves. The world has to rest from us.
The Sabbath is a weekly thing, every seventh day. But in the Old Testament, there is also a Sabbath year. Every seventh year, the land will rest. There will be a retreat from intervening in the earth, in the land.
It's Spring Cleanup Day at Abundance Farm in Northampton, Massachusetts. Abundance is a creative farming project supported by Congregation B'nai Israel, with help from the Lander Grinspoon Jewish Academy and the Northampton Survival Center that serves those in the area who struggle with food insecurity.
So Spring Work Day is our yearly big community workday event. We mulch the entire prayer space, the entire playground, our herb garden. So it's a chance to kind of spruce up the farm and get ready for the season ahead.
Here at Abundance Farm, they're bearing witness to one of the most important and challenging dimensions of the Sabbath story. This is the year of Shemitah, the once every 7-year call to release and to rest.
Shemitah is Grand Sabbath. It's called Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbaths. So it's a full year of Sabbath, the 7th year in a 7-year cycle. But we don't refrain from all kinds of work the entire year. What we refrain from, traditionally, according to the religious law, is agricultural work. And that includes not just things that you do to farm the land, but any kind of thing you would do to store and hoard food so that you can sell it. It's forbidden to sell the produce of the Shemitah year.
For 6 years we've been busting our butts, digging them holes and filling them up. Now we're gonna rest, release, renew. Come on, share that shepherd with you. Say, come on down to a little piece of heaven. Been working 6 years. Hey, gonna rest, release, renew. Do a little singing and dancing too.
We've made a commitment to start putting certain beds into a full year of cover crop, a perennial cover crop that lets the land rest. A cover crop is any plant that you're not trying to harvest anything from. It's a very Shemitah concept where you're planting certain plants in order to improve the soil as opposed to gain benefit through harvest from them.
The other thing we focus on a lot this year is the planting of perennials and the distribution of perennials as much as possible to the community, because a Shemitah-based agricultural society is one that is heavily dependent on perennials. So there's, food that kind of gives of itself in the 7th year without you needing to till the land, without you needing to plow and work and plant.
Technically, from the standpoint of the tradition, most of the agricultural laws only apply in the land of Israel. But certainly we and many other Jewish farms in North America feel that these are such compelling core traditions that, whether or not we feel like there's a technical obligation, we can't imagine not putting them into practice in some ways.
So there's been several movements of farming in the diaspora Jewish world. But the current one that we're in, which is so much motivated by ecology and this sense of responsibility to the earth, is really pretty new.
The values of the sabbatical year are baked into Abundance Farm for all 6 years in a different way as well. In that, one of the values that undergirds Abundance Farm is this idea that the land is hefker, meaning it's ownerless, which is a value or an understanding of land that traditionally only applies in the sabbatical year. But we've sort of expanded it to all 7 years of the cycle here at Abundance Farm.
The halachic law, the law about how humans are supposed to interact on the sabbatical year, is that we should treat all people equally so that anyone can go into anyone's field. Rich, poor, doesn't matter. Where you come from, Jewish, not Jewish, you go in anyone's field and take whatever you want because nobody owns anything.
So all of our contributions to Survival Center clients happen through our Pick Your Own program. Twice a week, anyone who wants can come through and pick from our fresh herbs, berries, vegetables, however much they want.
And part of that's living in a kind of trust in relation to God, in relation to the world around you, in relation to each other, more importantly, because if we can't hoard food, then we're entirely dependent on how we interact with each other and what we share, and creating equality between people.
Shemitah you could see as really as a blueprint for society. It's not a vision for a 7th year, it's a vision for civilization. In order to truly observe it in the way in which it's envisioned, you construct a society that operates 6 years in order so that you can actually observe the 7th year. You have to build a sharing economy such that you can't learn these things when you're in it.
At the end of the Shemitah year, there is still one more challenge.
In the day of Shabbat, one is living in potentially radical equality with the people around you and sharing with the people around you. And in the Shemitah year, one is doing that even to a greater degree. You're not allowed to hoard food. You're not allowed to sell it. You have to share it. But at the end of the Shemitah year, there's also the rule that all debts are forgiven.
This idea of forgiving debts has always been seen as one of the most challenging dimensions of the Sabbath and Shemitah teaching.
Thousands of years ago, in the context of the Torah, this was already the most radical teaching. And I would assert that all the more so today.
For Jewish children, summer camp not only offers an outdoor experience, but its own rite of passage. At Camp Ramah Darom, about 2 hours outside Atlanta, kids experience Shabbat in a way that may be very different from in their home congregations.
So Ramah Darom means south. And our region of campers come from Florida all the way up to the Carolinas and Tennessee, all the way west to Oklahoma, and down south to Texas, and everything in between. We're connected with the conservative movement, so we do have campers who are members of conservative synagogues at home, but we also have many campers who are associated with modern Orthodox synagogues, Reform congregations, or no congregation at all.
My experience growing up going to camp was definitely the most formative part of my childhood experience. I can definitely say I'm the person I am today because I came to this camp.
While kids are having fun and they think that's just what's happening, is everything has another purpose, a deeper meaning. Judaism and education are literally woven into the fabric of everything we do here.
Because you're learning about Judaism by practicing. You're learning about Shabbat by experiencing Shabbat. Most of our campers, by and large, do not observe Shabbat at home in the halachic, the Jewish legal way that we do here in camp.
There's just a general sense of excitement when Shabbat comes around. We get to connect with our campers, with the community. We get to connect in song. It's definitely the day that everyone looks forward to the most. A lot of the Shabbat days at camp consist of praying, tefillah, and it's a very communal, special experience. The campers at camp will actually lead this tefillah, so it's incredibly special for them.
The amphitheater is just like soaring with music, and it's really, really coming from everyone's heart. You can feel like everyone's souls like going up.
The lighting of the candles. Shabbat has arrived.
During Shabbat, I usually take the time to go on a trail or to the waterfall or something of that sort.
We are in like the most beautiful place at Ramah, and I feel like a huge part of Shabbat is taking time to appreciate like our world.
After a less structured day that allows for prayer, communal gatherings, and the chance to experience nature, sunset approaches. Shabbat is drawing to a close. Everyone gathers at the theater for the ancient rite of Havdalah, meaning separation, where spices, wine, and the braided candle are meant to pique the senses and mark a moment of transition. When the braided candle is extinguished in the wine, Havdalah is over, and a new week is welcomed in with anticipation and celebration.
They live in very small, southern, isolated Jewish communities, so just giving them a place to have that experience, which is Ramah Rome, lets them just see like the magic of Shabbat.
The garden keeps going, even when we're not here.
The life on the farm demonstrates, among other things, that life and death are always interconnected.
I think of Sabbath more as like what's happening in the garden in the winter, a time of rest when there's less sunlight, plants slow down, and we get to slow down as well as farmers.
The Farminary Project at Princeton Theological Seminary is now in its 7th year. With each cycle, the yield gets a little better, and the farmers a little wiser.
The vast majority of the produce goes into homes throughout the community. It's folks who have learned about what we're doing here, who have bought into it. All right, have you had this variety yet? Not, but try that. They come once a week to the farm to receive what we have harvested.
As a farmer who's learning how to cooperate with these cycles, I'm learning about how like Sabbath is sort of something that exceeds even my kind of like narrow understanding of Sabbath as something that happens only on Sundays.
But the question of limits, I think, is an inherently theological question. And it's raising this question of to what kind of life does God call us? Does God call us to a life without limits? That's where the Sabbath puts in a hard stop and says, no, that's not the life to which we're called.
The long, slow hunch here is that if we're going to have those conversations, perhaps the land itself should participate in those conversations. At the end of the day, for me, Sabbath is a practice in receiving life through death. The young people I spoke with sensed this, they got this, that if Sabbath rest was going to flourish and live in their lives, something else was going to have to pass away. Something else was going to have to die. The Sabbath invites us to die to lesser identities, lesser gods.
I would argue that we're living in a profoundly anti-Sabbath culture.
Our ancestors, they understood that a civilization that didn't stop would destroy itself. And we see the evidence of that all around us.
Another link to God that Shabbat brought into my life was this notion that I was being connected to practices that my ancestors had practiced.
It's hard to reflect positively when you're constantly running on empty.
And it's really that element of stopping and realizing that we're part of something greater than ourselves, which I think we see in the community.
And so congregations have a way to offer rest, have a way to build home and comfort in an otherwise very chaotic life.
So the real target, I think, of Sabbath rest is not just stopping, but figuring out what to do with the restlessness.
When we rest together, when we worship together, we are equipped then to go out into the world and do the work together.
The Sabbath is made to teach humanity something. It's made to teach us how we need to live in the world so that the world lives and thrives.
Was the establishment of the Sabbath for God or for us? In other words, by God setting an example of resting, is God saying, this is what it means to be a part of creation?
For more information about this film or the practice of Sabbath, visit journeyfilms.com. Major funding for this program was provided by Lilly Endowment. Additional funding provided by the Fetzer Institute, helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Danny and Alyssa Keto. The E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. And Skip and Fran Minikowski.